All right. Well, first of all, so thank you so very much for finding the time and responding so quickly.
It's a pleasure.
I just to cheer you up even more.
Uh-huh.
That's the collection of the first of the interviews from the first two seasons.
Okay, looks good.
Yeah, that's Merlin Sheldrake and right after you. Where is it? Okay, this is. Oh, here we are.
Oh la la.
Epistemological incident with Belgian police.
My
It-
goodness. It looks like a serious intellectual.
Yeah, so we now put together. We now actually we have put together. The book is not yet out. The third and fifth season interviews, and now that's the
Third and fourth.
third and fourth. Yes, sorry, of course. And
Well, it's good to see that people in Estonia continue to take these things seriously.
yeah, well, it's just amazing that we have the opportunity to do what we've been doing so far. And it's like I
You
don't.
know, it's funny. I'd be expecting to have these conversations with many people in many countries, but Um, actually, not so much. I don't know. The Estonians are right at the top of the. If you take the proportionate to the number of people in the country, and the conversations that I run into about these kinds of subjects, Estonia is number one, I think. I mean, it's a small sample, but
Yeah, of course,
still.
small sample. Yeah, but one of
You know, a Swiss German once told me, half jokingly, that his joke was we were talking about German and what a difficult language it is for some of us, and he said, yes, that's why German people think they're so smart because they can actually speak their own language. That that was the joke, but I think there's some truth in that. I actually think that the reason why there's so many philosophers in German is that German is a language that really does allow you to take reality apart and to think about it in all kinds of ways. Um, there must be something about Estonian. I'm not sure if it's by using the language, people are smarter. What does that mean? But they ask pertinent questions more easily, perhaps. I don't know. And then the culture builds on itself. You have this language that is that nobody else speaks. Nobody understands. I mean, I look at Estonian, I don't understand what's going on the page. Um, Even in Romanian, I can make it out, but well, Romanian is Latin, basically. So that it's your own little language bubble, and it's actually a very powerful one, it would seem. The results is that the people who speak Estonian are writing books, translating books, asking themselves questions in a proportion that is like remarkable compared to, I don't know. I don't want to put anybody else down, but there's I mean, obviously all languages are good, but I think some languages are better for some things and less good
exactly.
for others. I mean, we're not going to talk about language all day, but like French, what's interesting about French is that you have to be so logical with your grammatical connections, and the adjectives have to line up with the nouns and so forth, um, that it demands clarity. And it also likes to explicit the therefore, thus, this is the reason why, and so forth. It wants the causality made explicit and everything that is actually, and have a clear position in the sentence. So it favors clarity. It
Mhm.
calls for clarity. You've
Mhm.
got to know when you make the sentence, who's the subject, what the subject's doing, so forth. But French allows such clarity that people who speak French well, like the French, when they go on TV, they speak beautiful French. It's all sounds so clear, but actually they say nothing. They get up and speak beautiful French for a long time, actually to say next to nothing. So you can have a language that, if you're an outsider like me, I use French to actually try to think things through really clearly. Um, but it's also something that's easily abused. I
Mhm.
mean, yes, there are remarkable French thinkers, and I think they use the clarity of French to do that. But you have an awful lot of people who abuse the fact that they speak French well, and they use that to actually say nothing. But it sounds good.
Mm.
Mm.
Mhm.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
I don't know about you guys speak Estonian. I have no idea, but clearly there's something going on in Estonia.
Well,
This is fact.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There is a story of the Russian professor who was giving lecture at the beginning of '90s in America, and in Russian the phrase is "это факт." This means this is real. Well, it is so. But he went like directly. He translated directly that this is fact and this is fact and this is fact, and the audience was rather taken aback about all the things that supposedly fact.
Uh-huh. Yes. Well, so in other words, we're not going to get any closer to an international détente.
Yeah, yeah, that's if this is the case, then yes.
It's fucked. Yep, it's not looking that good.
Yeah, that's true.
Now
But
look, this guy's coming interrupted me.
oh,
He's just coming interrupted.
Wow.
He likes to sort of break into our these discussions. Whenever I have to Skype, he shows up and sort of squats the session.
yeah, but
So,
what is true and what I can speak from my own experience is that Estonian, whatever other advantages it may have, it forces me to think things through now that after we've recorded the interview, I have to go back and
Mhm.
go through it really.
Mhm.
That's really but I've become to appreciate that advantage of having my own little language.
well, actually, when I wrote The Cosmic Serpent 30 years ago, in fact, I was writing it. I was thinking in English, which is my mother tongue,
Mhm.
writing it in French, which is my second language, because I had a French employer and a French publisher lined up. And then when I'd done putting it into good French and publishing it, then I translated it back into English.
Mhm.
Um, and I think the book benefited from English, French, English.
Mhm.
But anyway, and so I understand that if we're going to talk here in English, then when you go back, transcribe it, and then see how you put it into Estonian,
Mhm.
that will obviously be an extra layer of interesting reflection.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
That's been an immense privilege to have to have been able to work with this paper and have all these interviews. It's just
you remember Rod Stewart said that blondes have more fun?
I know I
Um,
didn't.
okay, that was one of his hits. But my shtick is that bilinguals have more fun.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
I,
this is a theme you brought up in your guest lecture. I remember that.
uh,
Bilingual, yeah.
so
Somehow,
anyway,
yeah. Well, I gave you the background of the paper where we intend to use this interview, monoculturalism and its impact on South America that you are most familiar with. Just please
well,
ruminate that one.
I've actually ruminated the subject, and maybe I could take 5 minutes here,
Sure. As many
and
minutes as you like.
and then but please interrupt when you want, and if it's not at all what you're after, interrupt immediately. But
We trust your judgment.
Yeah.
okay, well. I thought about this for quite some time, and starting with the difference between Western knowledge and Amazonian knowledge. Um, then it turns out that Philippe Descola, so here's a French anthropologist and philosopher. There are people, so he too studied Amazonian societies. He too is a representative of Western knowledge and has looked at at these things. And he wrote an interesting book. You may have heard of it, Beyond Nature and Culture.
Yeah, I've heard. I think they translated it into Estonian recently. One of scholars,
Which would make sense. And so I found in his book, so I'll say what I retained from his book, and then when I finished, I'll say that I finished.
Mhm.
So the understanding then is that the domestication of plants and animals occurred in different places at different times, seemingly spontaneously. In other words, when it happened in Central America, it didn't. It happened in the Middle East. It happened in China. It happened in New Guinea and so forth, and in the Amazon, but in different ways. One of the earliest and one of the broadest, in other words, plants were domesticated, animals were domesticated in the Middle East, let's say 12,000 years ago. And this particular brand of domestication of plants and animals came with cereal culture, monoculture of cereal cultures, but different cereals, sedentary lifestyle, and domesticated animals that you live with. The world of the barn is what Descola calls it. And in the world of the barn, the men have more physical strength, more body mass than women. Basically, this world favored patriarchy. And at the same time, it also favored a taking of conceptual distance from plants and animals. In other words, you live above your animals. Somehow, if you're going to be so concentrated with them, you've got to take a distance from them, at least in your mind.
Mhm.
And so these are the people who ended up writing 3,000 years ago the first monotheistic text.
Mhm.
They conceived monotheism. So actually, the Middle Eastern brand of domestication of plants and animals, which included monoculture, but perhaps more importantly, the domestication of animals like oxes, where you need physical strength. Oxes have been domesticated in Africa by nomads, and they didn't start spouting monotheism. It's not because you have domesticated or semi-domesticated ox-like animals that you necessarily are going to become a monotheist. That's not at all what I'm saying. In China, people domesticated pigs, but the arrangement, there was no need to live so close to them, no need for such masculine physical strength, etc. Meanwhile, by contrast, in the Amazon, just saying, it's what anthropologists call a vegetal rather than an animal economy. Very little domestication of animals except for songbirds. I mean, dogs came with Europeans,
Mhm.
so that's not counting, and chickens. Um, so this is a place where there's hunting, which tends to be a male domain, but otherwise the vegetal economy is so there's culture, it's polyculture. Women have a bigger role. It's a lot more horizontal. Nobody is standing above anybody. The humans consider themselves as part of a horizontal world. Plants and animals are people like us. There is no taking of distance conceptually from the others, no pedestals that humans put themselves on.
Mhm.
And inasmuch as they're gods, they're kind of trickster figures who disappeared a long time ago, and everything is full of spirit anyway. it couldn't really be more different.
Mhm.
Actually, for us people who like to talk about these things, it's perfect. You have, the Amazonians over there, and then the monocultural folks over here. So then when it turns into, after 9,000 years of this Middle Eastern process, it turns into this monotheistic patriarchal religion. Well, just like humans have placed themselves above plants and animals in this scheme, they have also taken all the different gods that could have been and turned them into one and only above humans. God is actually created in the human image of the people writing this text. God is masculine, of course. People like Joseph Campbell have pointed out the patriarchal inversion in the Genesis story, where for the first time actually ever imagined, the feminine comes out of the masculine, Adam's rib. I mean, in real life, the masculine comes out of the feminine. It's the first time ever that this kind of weird notion occurred. The serpent was turned into a negative force here too. So there was something fishy from the start in that particular story. And it was then, if you look at the text of the Ten Commandments, you do have, I mean, it's commandments that presuppose social hierarchy. It's what do you do if somebody steals your cattle? What do you do if somebody steals your servants? It's a world where some people have more cattle than others. It's a world where some people are servants and other people are masters, and it's a set of rules to try to deal with that. And so if you look at the list of the Ten Commandments, so and then there's that one which is, I am your only God. So there's only one true God. This notion, so it's like humans are above plants and animals. And actually that's, the word capital, as in capitalism, comes from cattle. Cheptel, capital, head of, it's stock, actually, is what they call it in English. Stock market, stock is cows at the slaughterhouse, the stock house. Anyway, so yes, it's a world where you can have more resources than the other, more cattle than the other, more servants than the other. And it's a patriarchal, unequal, and vertical world that is encapsulated in those 10 commandments. Fine. And so then we move forward with, let's say, I don't know, up until 1500. The Renaissance and all that. What happens is the birth of, let's say, rationalism. I'm not talking about the Greeks. I mean, obviously the Greeks were doing their science stuff. And then the Renaissance was the return to Aristotle. So I'm kind of going fast here. Don't want to sort of do injustice to the Greeks and how they birthed rationalism. But when there was the Renaissance of the Greek ideas, the Cartesian, the whole vision of the rationalists, they were, it was a reaction to monotheism. Rationalism, monotheism says there is only one true God. Rationalism says we don't need that God. We can explain everything by measuring it and calculating it. And that explain everything. It's like the one and single God controlled everything. Here, we're going to get rid of that God. But we don't worry. Rationalism is sufficient to explain everything.
Exactly.
And
Everything.
And it is, in fact, the only way to true knowledge. It's just like God said, I am your one and only true God, forget all the rest. The rationalists reacting to that said, we are the one and only way to true knowledge. That's how they thought of themselves. And actually, it's quite funny because the cornerstone of the rationalist project was the Encyclopedia by Diderot and his colleagues, 1765, and at least the volume that contained the definition of the word shaman. So the rationalists in the early rationalists, they really did want to define the entire known world. And so they set about doing that. And so they put down in writing the first definition of what a shaman was. And by their reading, a shaman was an imposter who misleads a superstitious people and claims to have a communication with the devil. Compared to what the Christians were saying, they were saying these shaman people are communicating with the devil. They're ministers of the devil. So it was actually a move up for shamans to be defined as imposters because you don't get burned for being an imposter. They only claim they communicate with the devil. Of course, they don't communicate with the devil. In fact, the devil doesn't exist. The whole thing, the rationalists were atheists. So they were busy getting rid of God. And as several thinkers have pointed out, a world defined by an absence of a Christian God is still defined in relation to a Christian God. So the whole atheism thing of the early rationalists and later too, it is also a reaction against the theism. So let's just see. Yes, the imposters. The early rationalists looked at shamans like imposters. These people are purveyors of false knowledge. We are the only purveyors of true knowledge. The only way to verifiable, real knowledge is by doing it our way. And the other ways are not valid. They're wrong. They're false. They're irrational. They're no good. We don't have to burn these people, but what we do have to do is make sure that it's clear that their knowledge is false. So early rationalists, for ever so long, they were busy debunking shamans. And what's so interesting about shamans, besides what these people do and the whole history of the concept and so on, is that from the start, since Europeans have started leaving Europe and running into these different practitioners and then finally using the Siberian word to refer to them. And then once it stopped being men of religion who were writing the text and it became rationalists who were observing the shamans, they spent their time debunking them. So to put it schematically, you have from 1500 to 1700, 200 years of religious judgment on shamans, saying they're ministers of the devil. And then for 200 years, from 1700 to 1900, you have rationalists looking at shamans and saying they're imposters and purveyors of false knowledge. Shamans are the opposite of ourselves. There's been a fascination with shamans as being, and it's been like a dance. Now it's a 500 years dance, but here are these people, we don't understand them. Ooh, they're the ministers of the devil. No, they're purveyors of false knowledge. Actually, the early rationalists, there's lots of interest in shamans and how they manage to mislead people, and the whole obsession with debunking shamans was like the mirror image of this is what rationalism needed also to construct itself. If we are the only purveyors of true knowledge, allow us to show you what false knowledge is and how it works. So there was this dance that you can find in books and with historical sources. I think I've gone way past my 5 minutes. I'm gonna conclude. I'm gonna conclude so that we can at least do some ping pong. But So the idea is that monotheism grew out of a particular arrangement relative to how plants and animals were domesticated. I wouldn't put monoculture in there first and foremost. I would put domestication of plants and animals that led to a kind of a barn world with a verticality and a patriarchy built into it, that then actually, after thousands of years, produced pure monotheism, as in the words in the Bible, which is literally what it did produce. And that the patriarchy and the verticality and the inequalities were already built into that, and this kind of the mono knowledge thing, because God didn't say grow only one crop, but he did say, I am your only true God. So when one finally gets the birth of what we consider now rationalism, growing out of that, it had all that in it, but it's not as simple as just saying so monoculture and then mono thinking and so forth. But then it's very striking, and just to conclude, when you have the missionaries that go to the Amazon. So, I mean, their line of business is to convince Amazonians that their beliefs are false and that the only true religion is God. They've got to stop with all these other gods, and they've got to accept that there's only one God. And besides, if they want to do their gardens correctly, they should plant everything in straight lines and so on. Then you get the other Westerners, extractors, people who are there not for religion but for to get rich. They've also been busy convincing Amazonian people that their knowledge was worthless, and that they didn't know how to do agriculture, that they were wasting their resources by not cutting the forest down. I mean, this is what the experts of the World Bank.
Wrong model of development, basically.
That's it. And this was what the second half of the 20th century was all about, convincing Amazonian people that they knew nothing and that our knowledge was the only true knowledge. So it actually did have some very concrete effects. And it's troubling how seamlessly the missionary turns into the capitalist extractor. So there's, at least from the Amazonian point of view, like the message has been the same from the start. Your gods are wrong, your knowledge is wrong, your gardening is wrong, everything about you is wrong, the way you dress is wrong, everything. So you got to become like us. We are the only true, progressive, modern, healthy, intelligent way to go about it. And that's kind of where we are now. I mean, I'm simplifying. There are at least some bilingual intercultural education programs, and some people who are interested in bringing back and reevaluating indigenous knowledge and trying to build bridges. These kinds of things are happening. But 99% of the world that's out there, you go to the Amazon, the oil companies, the gold diggers, the government bureaucrats, even the medical doctors aren't much better. I mean, I've been surprised throughout you go to the outback in the Amazon, but the main problem is there is no doctor at all. Then, so you have a broken leg or something, and, people either they know how to figure it out. But then if you really you travel the 100 kilometers to go and find a medical doctor. So you run into a medical doctor in the middle of nowhere. 9 times out of 10, these are people uninterested in local medicine, who consider that local medicine is not medicine. That there's only one true medicine, and it's the one that the medical doctor embodies. So that you get this our knowledge / religion / agricultural practice, whatever, is the only true way of going about things. And this is what comes out of the mouths of the descendants of those Middle Eastern folks who domesticated plants and animals 12,000 years ago. There, I've finished. So having said that, it was that along the lines of what you were.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's just from the opposite end we approach but that doesn't matter. The sum doesn't depend on the model. What was but how concretely kind of the kind of specific examples of monoculture, what you witnessed yourself, and how did I mean? I remember from our first two conversations that that's really what motivated you to go to the Amazonia was just the attempts to convert the Amazonia into a huge parking lot. That was the initial. So perhaps how did you? We haven't covered that.
Okay,
But,
sure,
but,
I'd be happy to.
yeah, how did you get into that project?
Well,
What happened before you went to Amazonia?
okay. I myself am a reaction to monotheistic religion. In other words, I went to a Jesuit high school in Switzerland. My father was an atheist, an Egypto-Irish atheist. My mother was an Anglican from England. So I kind of got raised a little bit in Anglicanism, and then we moved to Catholic town in Switzerland, and I went to the Catholic high school where I was kind of an outsider as a Protestant. But still, what they instilled, what I thought was pertinent, and in fact, in the New Testament, this thing about the rich, the poor, like a rich man has about as much chance to go to heaven as a camel has of passing through the eye of the needle, he said. Well, right. So if that's true, then and then this was at the point that, there was Allende in Chile, there were the copper mines in Chile, there was all this stuff going on where the so-called good guys, the Europeans, the Americans, the people who like freedom and democracy and science, were actually doing all this stuff that was, I don't know, so they were, as usual, accumulating wealth, and there were these inequalities among people. And that was the one thing that I wanted to look into. I wanted to understand this rich, poor thing. I wanted to see what could be done about it. And I was only 18 years old in 1978. This may be a bit of a long answer to your question, but
Right.
I didn't know what to do. My father said, if you don't know what to do, study history. I studied history. It actually didn't really cut the cake as far as I was concerned. But I ran into a friend, a university student who was a year or two ahead of me, and he said, you should be studying anthropology with what you're interested in. Oh, yeah. So I took a course and, yeah, this is interesting. And so then I signed up to do a master in anthropology. And yes, this was exactly what I was looking for. Inequalities of race, class, and gender. That's what we're looking at. Yes. And then a professor said, look, so I said, okay, race, class, and gender. I'm interested in rich and poor and third world. And so one professor said, you should look at indigenous people, a case where you have on the one hand developers and on the other hand indigenous people. Indigenous people are the Achilles heel of all approaches to development. Capitalist or communist approaches to development run into these people who live in out-of-the-way places on top of vast natural resources that they don't use rationally. And so you choose a place where this is going on. And actually, at that point in 1982, 1983, the one of the best places to go to look at this was the Peruvian Amazon. World Bank on the one hand, barefoot Indians with bows and arrows on the other. And the World Bank's view was it was already quite clear from ecological critiques that what they were promoting, which was large-scale first of all, territorial confiscation of indigenous territories, large-scale deforestation, and distributing the lands in question to individuals with a market mentality so that they would put cattle pastures on these deforested lands and call this development. Trouble was that when you deforest at such a scale, and you do put cattle on it, within a year or two, it becomes a sterile pasture. All the biological wealth is above the soil. There is next to no accumulation of humus, like in our European forests, no topsoil that's worth anything. That if you take the cover off and burn it, very little wealth is left. What you have is like pretty sterile and acidic clay in many places. It's like a tennis court.
Mm.
And so that you can cut down huge areas and put cattle pastures there for 2-3 years. But then you have to start over and do the same. It's not sustainable, in other words. And this was already clear in 1983. But there were the political interests, the Peruvian government, Brazilian government, and so on. So you had, and then I don't know, there were experts who were spouting this stuff. They must have believed it, but these were really times when the World Bank foresters, agronomists would fly over an area like the one where I went and lived, and they would see intact forest under which Asháninka people were busy living their lives. And they would say, see, these areas are unused.
Mhm.
The point of my research was to go and document all the uses that the indigenous people had of the forest, so including collecting plants, hunting, fishing, but also gardening. And so this is where it got interesting, because Asháninka people, they had more or less settled down. They had just ceased to be so nomadic, but they were still going off on treks all the time. They had a kind of but a few generations ago, they didn't really even have fixed domiciles. With the outside world coming in and so forth, finally people had been, in the 1970s, they'd taken to the Peruvian state, said, we can give you lands in the form of indigenous communities. So you got to actually stay there and live there and so forth. So they were in the process of sedentarization. They had their gardens, but the gardens were small. So they would cut trees down. But actually then, this was the funny thing is that, so I was just a naive guy from the suburbs. I didn't know anything about cropping, planting, anything, agriculture. And so it was, okay, we've cut the garden down, we've burned it and so forth. Now we're ready for planting. Okay, sure, I'll give you a hand. Okay, you help me plant the corn. All right, today we'll plant the corn. So I spent this, for me, it was crazy. The guy would he'd put a hole here, a hole there, a hole here, a hole there. And I'd be trying to follow him. It was like, why can't you do this in a straight line?
Mhm.
But no, it was this insistence on many different crops, no plant close together. It actually looks like there's nobody's gardening after a while. It sort of grows, but in there, it turns out that when indigenous Amazonian people cut down, let's say, less than a hectare, what they do is they imitate the forest, which is the most diverse place, biological place in the world, the Peruvian Amazon. They put as many different plants as possible. They do not value one single crop. In fact, one single crop wouldn't work. You would have illnesses. There are all kinds of very practical reasons that in the Amazon, you don't want to do monoculture unless you can afford pesticides and all these other things that they didn't have. So they would imitate the forest, mix it all up, encourage subsequent generations of fruit trees. And so that it turns out that and then the forest regains its rights very quickly. You go and see these 3 or 4-year-old gardens, and they're like covered in trees that are 6 or 7 meters high already. You say, where's the garden? How can you tell it's the garden? Oh, because it has all these young trees in it. And it turns out that the studies now show that when they look at the biodiversity of old gardens, are higher than the biodiversity of the forest. In other words, that indigenous Amazonians, traditionally anyway, the kind of agriculture that they practice not only imitates the forest, but actually enriches it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the kind of use that these people were doing in front of my eyes. I understood all this during the 2 years that I was there. I also read publications by, I don't know, there was a guy like Darrell Posey. He was an anthropologist writing about the intelligence of indigenous Amazonian agriculture. The difference was incredibly striking because so here were these people who could use the most biodiverse area in the world, imitate it and enrich it, and at the same time use it to produce their food and productively, in other words, without destroying it. And meanwhile, here are the Western experts flying over and saying these people are savages. They don't know what they're doing. Their gardens are small and messy. They're not using their resources rationally, and they need to be civilized. So it couldn't have been more extreme. I think that the extremism of that situation is what motivated me to, okay, I'm going to give my life to this.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm. Now that you, when I was listening to you, a name of Robert Bly. Did you know have you heard of the American poet Robert Bly?
Uh-huh.
He says that America is the first country in the world which has colonized itself. I think it applies to the Western world in general. Does that sort of kind of ring a bell in you? How would
Yeah,
you that?
you know that guy, Trump's co-lister, what's his name? The guy with the beard anyway.
Yeah. Steve,
Mr. What's his name?
yeah.
He said, because we're talking about stopping immigrants coming in, So he said, yeah, I'm talking about true Americans, seventh generation people in Kansas. That's the kind of people I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You're thinking 7 generations, okay. But what about like 15 generations ago?
Mm-hmm.
What's this thing about we all know? Well, the problem was 15 generations ago, they were all indigenous Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like this completely arbitrary point where
Right.
true Americans start existing. And they say this, they don't even understand the how damning their own words are. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, but how to go for? But how do tree fields versus forest? What's your take on that? Have you has the word pair of or the concept of tree fields? Have you come across of that?
Well, you see, like a fish is not really that aware of the water that it swims in. Like most people, I wasn't really aware of all the presuppositions behind my culture. So, being born in Canada, Canadians like trees, okay? They have a maple leaf on their flag. Fine. So we like trees. That's at least what Canadians believe and tell themselves. I grew up in the suburbs of Montreal. I love trees. I used to love climbing trees. Um, Really, I liked spending time in trees. Whenever I could climb a tree, I'd go climb a tree, and there it was. Um, then when we moved to Switzerland when I was 10, the Swiss like trees too. There's lots of trees, and we ended up living close to the forest. I've always liked trees. Um, and then when you go to before going to the Amazon, I went to California. There were the redwoods. Now those are trees, they're huge trees. So that's something. It's almost of another order, but they're clumps of redwoods or small forests. Like if you go and visit them, they're like you go and visit Manhattan or something, except you look at the skyscrapers, except they're trees. But then when you get to the Amazon, it's the forests of Canada and Switzerland are ridiculously poor in species. For the simple reason that both places used to be covered in ice 20,000 years ago. The forests have grown back very recently. They're very poor in species. And actually, Canada has a culture of cutting down trees, of it's motor sports out in nature. It's actually very Canadian to you both want to have your cabin by the lake, but you want your skidoo, you want your quad, you want your chainsaw, you want all these things that can allow you to control this thing. And if you got to cut a tree down, then go, there's enough trees around. So if ever there were a place where you have this thing of cutting down the trees, the whole history of agriculture, once again, is based on cutting down trees. I think the word culture and agriculture, they have their same root. So there's nature, savage is silva, the forest, and everything, and culture is built as an opposition against this. Agriculture and culture are cutting down trees and cultivating. And in Canada, you can see this. So there is this world of trees out there, and it's like endless. But cutting into it is what we do, and there's no big problem with it. I mean, Canadians they have a huge country, but they in some, like in the tar sands in Alberta, they just cut into it without they just go cut the whole thing and extract the whole thing and pollute the whole thing on massive scales. And the country, I'm not talking about the indigenous people of Canada, but the white and now pluricultural descendants, that Canada was built on that whole idea, while telling itself the story that it was a country of rather nice people. Actually, it doesn't have a very nice history relative to indigenous people, and its ecological record is deplorable. So, and this has been going on, so it's like 250 years old now, this country. So that was where I came from, the water I was swimming in without even realizing it. Actually, when I got down to the Amazon, some of the worst companies in terms of ecological performance were Canadian oil companies or Canadian mining companies. I mean, it's no coincidence that many of the big mining companies are Canadian. Canadians are like rabid resource extractors. They're professionals in like clear cutting forests. They really invented the method of just like cutting it all down. So that was the water that I grew up swimming in. Switzerland, it's a bit more discreet. They've also had to handle big nature, the Alps, and domesticating it. And actually, thanks to international capital, it used to be a country that was poor in resources and poor until, like, I don't know, the early 20th century. And after the two wars, and then this capitalist world, now Switzerland has become a rich country, but not because of its natural resources. So now it's just a kind of a countryside that we can look at. From any big town in Switzerland, you can see the mountains. You're reminded of the strength of nature, but it's still, the whole country is like it's gardened. So that too, it's all, the forest is under control. There's hardly any wild forest in Switzerland. And the place where there is wild forest, it's because they've put a national park there. So it's kind of like an artificial decision. And in Canada, it's all such poor, the trees that have grown back since the glaciation are conifers, essentially. It's very poor in species. So both places, growing up in those two countries, and I'm sure Estonia is not too far from a mix between these two.
Yeah.
One thinks, yes, this is all normal. These forests are normal. I like trees and I like the forest. And then suddenly you walk into the Peruvian Amazon and you realize that you were in kindergarten and now you're at, I don't know, Harvard.
Mhm.
It's it actually takes your words away. There are so many different kinds of trees, the size of the trees, all the different species at different levels on the ground, at this level further up, and the whole thing is alive and noisy and wet.
Yep. But now that I remember I sent you the excerpt from the film as well when there is this first counter between the Indians and the Jesuit missionary. Now that we have encountered each other and this has been going on for a few centuries, how do you see this thing is going now? Which is in this globalizing world, we just cannot make even the face anymore that this is ours is the only story around. How do you people I've been talking about the second axial age and kind of and it doesn't take that much imagination to argue that maybe this is on the sort of fundamental scale. This is exactly what is going on. Just search for no new story for new religion and so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, there's a number that I like, and it's about just the last thing that I was saying, which is that they actually delimited a hectare in the Amazon forest and counted the number of tree species. And in this one place, it was like 310. In Europe, there are 270 tree species in all of Europe. More species on 1 hectare than on the whole continent. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. It's kind of stupefying. But just to put it, I mean, yes, it's 5 times taller, but it's so much more diverse that we almost have no understanding of it, of the thing. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there is this really, I think it's an important book. It's by this Brazilian Yanomami shaman called Davi Kopenawa. The book is called The Falling Sky. It was co-written with an anthropologist called Bruce Albert, but he's simply the writer. But he writes Davi Kopenawa's words. And this book has been compared to Das Kapital by Marx because it actually takes apart the world. And he has long chapters on his views of white people. And there's one chapter in particular, chapter 19, merchandise love of merchandise. So because he's been several times to Europe and to North America and then come back. And he says, in brief, these are people, they're obsessed with their merchandise. They dream about their merchandise at night. They're willing to extract minerals from the earth and to cut all the trees down and to turn all this into merchandise. And they have a limitless hunger for these resources. They can't accumulate enough merchandise. They are completely obsessed by their merchandise. And there seems to be no end in sight. And they will cause the ruin of the world. Well, kind of bleak. I'm not sure that Davi Kopinawa has a crystal ball, and I know that I certainly don't. But if you stop the frame right now, so 24th September 2024, boom, they're extracting, sucking out the oil, mining. They're taking the minerals out of the earth, just like Davi Kopinawa says. They're turning it all into merchandise. It's becoming a big sea of plastic in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's eating away all the inhabitable space, so there's less and less room for vertebrate animals, less and less species, less room for everybody except those who love merchandise. That question, it was also a question that was put to me when I was with the Asháninka. Was because they had gold in their rivers, and so they'd understood that white people like gold. So they actually several times different guys would come around and test me, say, "Hey, you know what? I know a river over there where there's a bit of gold, and if you want, I could take you there." And I'd say, "Ah, gold? Oh no, man, I'm not interested in that." What? A white person not interested in gold? Huh, now that's interesting. Well, let's talk with this guy a little bit. So, tell me, why are white people so obsessed with gold so that you give them gold and all they want is more?
Mm.
What could I say? I'd say, look, that's a good question. It is a good question. To this day, it remains a good question. I mean, everybody, I guess there are some people they're talking about, earning, living with less, what is it called? The contrary of growth, growing the economy smaller. Some people talk about that, but they're very minority. You hardly ever hear about it. The presupposition of the whole industrial world that we're a part of is that more is better without limits. The more you get paid, the more money you have. Nobody's going around saying, "Oh, look how great this is. I have very little," or very, very few people are saying this. So the system is still overwhelmingly rigged in favor of accumulating more. What I think is interesting with the Amazon also, and this is by experience from living there, is that accumulation a priori is not part of their life experience because nothing accumulates. If you put a t-shirt out on the line and you leave it there for 6 months, it'll be gone. There'll be no t-shirt. Everything, it's so humid, so hot. Food, you can't keep food. There's nothing you can accumulate. I suppose gold, but then what use is gold? I mean, gold isn't going to rust. Ants aren't going to eat it. Nothing will happen to your gold, so it could just sit there. But I mean, who wants gold? It's useless. Anything that could be interesting to an Amazonian person. Accumulating it like one might save money is just like not part of their mentality. On the contrary, it's how do you keep manioc in the earth so that it stays there for months and remains edible? Let's select manioc varieties so that you can accumulate underground certain plant species and so on. You don't want to overkill all the animals and all the fish. You want to make sure that there's fish and game all the time. So you want to do it in a balanced way. It's all about achieving a balance so that you can survive. And so actually Amazonian people tend to be really bad with money. They just don't know how to save money. Saving isn't part of their thing. Accumulating capital is just like not part of their thing. So they're all in favor of having money. And they know that you use money, you can go and buy this, that, and the other, and that's cool. But money tends to really burn a hole in their pockets when they get some. Concrete cases like the people who wanted to help them. So let's get some cacao going. So all these people grew cacao and then they took a huge boatload of cacao to market. And then they got a whole bunch of money for their cacao. And what did the people do? They got drunk. The men took the money and bought all kinds of alcohol and got drunk. You think, oh man, was this a successful project? Well, from a purely monetary point of view, it was great. It worked. They actually, but so suddenly you help people produce something that actually gets them a lot of money. They don't know how to use money. Why would they know how to use money? Money is this abstract thing that the people who wrote the Ten Commandments ended up coming up with. It's so that you can accumulate capital without having to live above a bunch of oxes in your barn. Your capital, it's no longer ox, it's dollars.
Yeah.
And you can accumulate billions. I mean, that's the thing when you think about these billionaires. It's like if you try to tell an Amazonian person about the wealth of a billionaire, so this person could have a mountain of meat that would be this tall. He could have 1 billion cheeseburgers and it would stand this tall. He'd never be able to eat it in his life. So why would you want that? Why would you want all that? It's sort of kind of incomprehensible in that mentality. And once you start looking at it from the outside, so you're a Westerner, you grew up swimming in Canadian waters and so on, but then finally you get outside and you see what your world looks like from the other point of view. And this is where David Kopinawa's book is so interesting, because you really do relentlessly see his point of view on us. And you see, it's kind of like when you look in one of those mirrors that has one of these kind of very blasting lights, you see all the faults. You see how, it is not a flattering mirror. Well, David Kopinawa is not a flattering mirror. You see, so, oh yes, we love our merchandise. We dream about it at night. We're prepared to ruin the earth for it and dirty the rivers and kill all the fish. And what wouldn't we do to accumulate more? There's no end in sight. We don't even know why we're so obsessed with this accumulation of what actually we're extracting ourselves out of house and home. It's the only planet where we have, and nobody's pushing to stop it. It's already also clear in terms of, without even talking about climate, just talking about species disappearing and vital space left to other species. It's and plastic floating in the ocean. We're already at this point where it should long be clear that the several things need rethinking. And I think that like that questions, so how much is enough? How much, so this idea that anybody, if they know how to use the system and contribute to it, it's so that, I don't know, you make a Tesla automobile or whatever, and you can then have, I don't know how many hundred billions of dollars corresponding to hundreds of billions of cheeseburgers you'll never eat. Are we just going to sort of say, oh, yes, this is the value we've got to, in the name of freedom and enterprise, we've just got to allow this system to keep on keeping on, because otherwise it's communism or something bad, and we've got to allow unbridled industrial extractivism to keep on keeping on, and we're going to soup it up with all our computers, all our capacities, and it's all going to be invested along those lines. I've seen very little coming out of the, I don't know, higher levels, authorities, world banks, politicians, anybody, even the United Nations, calling for a rethink of this stuff. And yet the results of the abuse that it's causing to the world are evident to almost everybody. I mean, every taxi driver in the world knows there's a continent of plastic floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Everybody knows.
Yeah.
Approaching the end of our, so.
You mentioned the word balance, and it seems to me that this balance is key word here. If you were talking about this ancient culture and this modern world, we have thought a lot about this, that there should also be balance between ancient traditions and modern world. And what do you think, what could be these primary areas where we can achieve this balance?
modern wisdom and ancient wisdom and modern science, basically. Where's that's the.
Well, I think to do a full circle, there is a connection between the monotheism and this current ecological industrial situation, because not only do we not put limits on human activity, but most modern industrial humans still consider themselves above plants and animals. And because we or they do not consider ourselves as part of the biological fabric, then we consider that we can do to it what we want, just like God said in Genesis 1:28, it's yours to use. So we're above it, we're not a part of it, and we can use it as we please. And don't put any limits on that, otherwise we're going to get upset. Well, that is the problem. I can't think of a simpler and clearer way of saying what the problem is. And that is a relationship that is fundamentally out of balance. You know, there's no room for balance in that one. It's completely imbalanced. We're above. It's like if it's balanced, it's like that. We're above and it's below, and we have more weight. We decide, and it's our rules, and we're applying them, and finished. And there's one species that's important, and all the rest are subservient to us. And et voila, where is the balance? There isn't any. Then what can this crazy world of ours learn from indigenous societies like the Amazonian societies that I had the privilege of spending time with? I think that it's not so much a question of imitating them or doing like them or learning to re-become like them or one of those things, or pretending we are Indians or any of this business. I mean, you know, if you want to go and live in a teepee out in the forest, you're welcome to. Still, I don't think that that's really the solution. Or, you know, it can be an interesting exercise, but I think that the indigenous societies are there to show that other ways are possible. I think we have to rethink our thing ourselves. I mean, you know, one place for rethinking, and it's quite a simple one. It's that you say, okay, now I understand that science has demonstrated humans are part of the fabric. Plants and animals are beings like us. They're not just objects. They're also subjects like us. It's not a crime to anthropomorphize and to consider that they are like us. No, that's having compassion and opening ourselves up to the idea that other species are beings like us. And so that I'm not above. There's no pedestal. It was just a pedestal in our minds. I've got to learn as a human in a modern world to come down from the pedestal and look at the blades of grass and the trees and the dogs and the birds as beings like myself. I've got to relearn conceptually to understand that once you understand that there's not just humans and that plants and animals and bacteria and so forth have their importance and it's all one fabric. I think that is it's a necessary. I'm not sure whether you balance. You see, balance is kind of the end result of once you get things right for a long time. So we're such a long way from getting things right for a long time that balance is maybe it's something we can aspire to later on. But you know, let's already get off the pedestal. Let's get our feet back on the ground. That could be some form of balance to get started. Let's having a more balanced relationship with the other species where we put ourselves on the same footing. that if you actually consider that the plants in your garden are pretty similar to yourself, you stand less chances of covering them with pesticide and herbicide. So just simple practical stuff. Once you have rethought your position and the relationship and the nature of who we are sharing the world with, that's already a huge step, and that what comes with it are all kinds of adjustments. So what are there? 6 billion industrial people in the world, 7 billion maybe, or maybe even 8. How many? I think we're 9 billion now, or is it only 8? So I don't know, 90% at least of all these people are part of the industrial kind of thing. Let's just say in a thought experiment that all of these people could learn a new, less detached way of being in the world. And let's say that could happen during the next 12 months. And so we'd be in 12 months' time and we'd be in that world. How close would we be to a world that would be in balance? I'm not sure that we'd be closer. But I'm sure that to get there, that's the thing. When you look at these Amazonian societies, we don't want to put them on a pedestal. One of their secrets is that they're small scale. They live in huge areas of nature, and they engage plants and animals in dialogues, and they try to understand their point of view. And so they are deliberately attentive to the non-human, trying to listen to it, to decode it, to use it, but in a way that's not going to harm them because they think that there's a karma. The balance is also in our interest. It's that if you don't live in balance and you have imbalanced stuff that happens, like illness, like snakes bite you, these are the things that imbalance brings about in their view. So balance is not just an abstraction. It's what you want to live a successful life as the generations go by. And so they managed to do that in those circumstances. Whether humanity will get to be able to do such a thing on a planetary scale, I think is going to take, I don't know, thousands of years probably. That's off the top of my head, but it doesn't look like balance is anywhere near. But I only say that to be lucid rather than to be discouraging. It's just like it's going to be a long process if you consider how long it took us to get into this mess we're in. Actually, those 12,000 years of domestication of plants and animals through monotheism, through rationalism, through capitalism, and here we are sitting on top of all that. We've dominated the whole planet. We've won. We're sitting on all this stuff, and we're completely cut off in our minds and in our practices from the fabric. And we got to get back to that fabric and rebalance the whole thing. I don't know. 12,000 more years, maybe.
Oh, going insane in the midst of atomic bombs, but it's like
if we manage not to I think that the main risk would be scratching ourselves off the surface of the planet, because I think the plants will still be there.
Yeah. Well, on that cheerful note.
On that cheerful note.
Well, certainly,
we have important things to do now.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and as I said, it will appear in the November issue, and after that I make the video also available. And
oh, okay. Well, look, it's very kind of you to ask these questions. As I was saying, it's always a pleasure to be able to talk about them, because there's so few people who are actually asking them. And if you would like any sort of details about anything I said, references or what have you, don't hesitate to write.
What we certainly would like to have is perhaps we can use the same photo, but if you have a couple of more photos to spare, we'd be happy. But we can use the same.
Okay. All right. I'll see what I can do.
Yeah. Right.
Very good.
But apart from that, it's just thank you so much, and it's always a pleasure to converse with you.
Yeah.
Likewise.
All right.
Thank you for enjoyable time.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. I enjoyed it too.
Bye then. All
Ciao,
right.
ciao.
Ciao.